I have left one rishi amongst you, which is tarka, the capacity to infer, the capacity to draw conclusions, rational thinking. That is the last rishi that I have left with you. Follow that.
Namaste and welcome to the Vichar Manthan podcast. My name is Sumit Sharma and it's my great privilege to be a part of this team. The Vichar Manthan podcast is a VM project looking to explore modern day issues through a dharmic lens in hopefully a relaxed and engaging manner. Please tune in and subscribe, and if you agree or disagree with any of the comments, please let us know. Let's keep the conversation going in an earnest manner. Be critical and let's explore together. You can email me on podcast@vicharmanthan.org. Today, I'm very fortunate to be joined by Siddhartha Krishna, who currently resides in Rishikesh, and is going to help me understand a topic that I think I have been trying to explore for many years. Maybe not proactively, but any time is great right now. If I look back at the civilization that I come from, I know there are many scriptures, there are many books. If we refer to some of the Abrahamic faiths, they have like a single book. So often I wonder, what is the Hindu book? And so Siddhartha ji here today is going to help us uncover what I'm calling the Hindu library. Siddhartha ji currently resides at the Omkarananda Ashram in Rishikesh, and actually I'm going to bring him in now to explain a little bit further. Siddhartha ji, welcome to the VM podcast.
Thank you very much, Smriti. Thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this podcast.
Thank you. I think we have much to uncover from the topic we have, and from you as well. You know, in some of our earlier conversations, I've already begun to learn a little bit about where scripture comes from. But for our audience at home, and maybe for anyone that's not tuned in before, can you help us understand sort of who you are, where you come from, and why you know so much about a topic like this?
I live in Rishikesh, which today is known really as the world capital of yoga. I was born into a family of yoga teachers and yoga practitioners, which means that my father is a scholar of Sanskrit. He has been teaching yoga as well as giving discourses all his life on various scriptures in India as well as abroad. And my mother is a senior Iyengar yoga teacher. So she has been studying for more than 20 years with B.K.S. Iyengar, one of the topmost yoga teachers in the 20th century. And so I grew up, first of all, in this family with a very strong yogic background. And then it was the decision of my father to introduce me to Sanskrit at a very young age. And so the first thing that already at the age of 4.5, and this in fact started when I was in London for a few months in 1984, that my father asked my mother to make me learn the Bhagavad Gita by heart.
Oh, wow.
And
at the tender age of 4. That's
4.5. Yes,
wow,
that's how the journey started. And then, yes, as we came then to Rishikesh when I was 5, first of all, I studied with him, and then at the age of 8, he took me to Kailash Ashram, which is a 150 years old monastery here in Rishikesh, specifically dedicated to the study of Advaita Vedanta. People like Swami Vivekananda have been related to it. Chinmay Mission has been related to it. So, so since my childhood, I've been in this environment. And then after that, I wrote several books, and I've been teaching these texts basically since 2004.
Very nice, and we're blessed on the podcast to have you here today to
Thank you very much.
unlock.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, and we're gonna hopefully unlock some of this wisdom. So, I guess if we dive right into it, really, if I look at some of the Abrahamic faiths, you can pinpoint a single book mostly about, I guess, what is most important to that religion. But when I look at Hinduism, like I know that we have several books and people revere the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and then the Gita kind of has an extra shining light on it. So Siddhartha-ji, help me understand. Where does it all begin? What's maybe the first book? I've got many questions. So maybe if you help us understand, where does it all start?
The very origin of the Hindu culture lies within the Vedas. So that's really the very starting point. Amongst all the texts, collections of teachings that are available to us today, the Vedas are really the most ancient and foundational to the Vedic tradition, to the Vedic civilization. That is why it is known as the Vedic civilization.
So and you say ancient. So how? What does that mean?
According to modern historians, that means at least 3,500 years ago. But of course, there is a lot of debate around that. Some people
Sure.
believe it's even 10,000 years, but yeah, mostly the consensus right now lies at 3,500 years
Sure.
approximately.
So definitely a long time before a lot of modern civilization as we know it.
Yes.
And so let's understand the Vedas in more detail. So I know there's four of them. Are they all dedicated to a different thought process, or what are they really about? Why would one be interested in the Vedas? Is it simply because they were the first ones? Is that right?
Yeah. So first of all, there is this, the most ancient one is believed to be the Rig Veda, which is a collection of hymns dedicated to different deities, but the Rig Veda itself, in one place at least, expresses very clearly that these all deities, they are different names of the same timeless presence, just being expressed through different names. And as some traditions also believe that they have specific forms, so according to those traditions, then also different forms. So the Rig Veda has hymns dedicated to these deities. Samaveda, most of the Samaveda, in fact, are mantras, verses taken from the Rig Veda, but the style of recitation is very different. It's more, it's sung instead of, it's not recited, but it is sung. So that's Samaveda. That's why Indian classical music has its origins in Samaveda as well.
That's
And
that's
then,
very that's very interesting. The point you're making there. So Rig Veda, you would say, are more like a set of hymns that are
yes,
recited,
Rig Veda has, yes, they
and
are recited.
Samveda is more like mantras that are sung. And
Yes.
so the very externalization of this knowledge when spoken out loud is done in a different manner. And I'm gonna assume that's fundamental to the knowledge within.
Yes, yes. Uh, for example, then the Yajurveda is more spoken. The Yajurveda is not composed in meter, it has no meter at all.
Right.
And it's dedicated more to rituals. So, Yajurveda is the most ritualistic of all. So, you can say Rigveda is more devotional,
Okay.
Samaveda is more singing, devotional as well as singing,
Sure.
and Yajurveda has more rituals in it. And then the fourth one, the Atharva Veda, is a collection of many, many things. It has hymns. It has and it has also what can be seen as some formulas which bring change in life, but then have also deeper meaning. So that's
Wow.
the Atharva Veda.
Wow. That's
But
quite
something that usually is not often mentioned is that each one of these Vedas then has 4 sections within them.
Okay.
One is the most ancient section, which are the hymns, and then the second section is like a ritualistic commentary. The third section, the Aranyakas, they are meditative commentaries. And then the last one, the Upanishads, they are mystical commentaries. They have the realizations of those ancient masters.
Wow.
Yeah, so each Veda has these 4 clearly
Built into
defined
sections, yeah.
sections.
So there's a lot to unpick there. And I'm going to go with the last thing you said about the Upanishads. So that's another, in my buzzword when it comes to the Hindu library. So the Upanishads are the 4th section within each.
Yes, that's why they are also known as Vedanta, the end of the Vedas, or the conclusion, the quintessence of the Vedas. That is why
Brilliant.
this word is also used for the Upanishads.
Very nice. And what does and what let's define our term. So Vedas, where does the word come from? What is the meaning
The
of
word
Veda?
Veda comes from the root vid, which means to know. So basically, Veda simply just means, very literally, it means knowledge. It
Knowledge,
means
right?
wisdom.
And knowledge of what though? Like the world, how it is, the nature of reality.
The knowledge of one's true nature, the knowledge of what I, as an individual, am in the absence of any external influence, but what I am really in my true nature when not being influenced by anything external.
And that's quite a feat, I think, in
That's
the
quite a
modern
feat.
world. I think especially in the modern world as well, right? Where, people who live a fairly normal life, have a 9-to-5 job, have a car, kids, there are thousands of things that are going to affect their psyche, affect their mental. But so what we're really talking about here is some fairly deep spiritual. Those perhaps reading this are maybe detached, perhaps non-materialistic, but not necessarily, right? Anyone can read the Vedas.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the Vedas, that's why they have these different sections for people in different stages of life. And I mean, today mindfulness has become such a big thing. Everybody is talking about it. Yeah, and it comes from one of the Upanishads. It's, in fact, mindfulness is a translation of the word sati as used by the Buddha, which originates in that particular sense in its Sanskrit form, smriti, in Chandogya Upanishad. So it's a method of achieving that state of inner pristine calmness, which is the nature, which was thought to be the very nature of every living being when not under the influence of external circumstances. This does not mean a total disconnect from external circumstances, but learning not to allow the external changing circumstances to influence the inner too much.
Brilliant. And ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here on the Vicharamanthan podcast. Mindfulness, the popular term that we heard here today, came from ancient Hindu texts, from within the Upanishads, inside the Vedas. That's where mindfulness came from.
Yes.
Brilliant. There is much wisdom to be learnt. And thank you again, Siddhartha ji, for coming on to the VM podcast to help us uncover a little bit further what we're calling the Hindu library. So we've talked a little bit about Vedas and what they are, and I'm sure there is lots more to talk about those, but we've got to get through this library, right? I need to understand a bit further. So let's move on to the Upanishad. So what does Upanishad mean?
Yeah. Upanishad is, Upa means close, and Nishad means to sit down. So the most simple, I mean, the word can be explained in several different ways, but the most simple explanation of this term would be the wisdom that a student receives as he sits down close to his teacher. That would be the first layer. And the second layer would be that ultimately it is the wisdom that a person receives as he or she sits close to themselves, to their true nature. So, in very simple terms, that is what we call. Shat is in fact the same word as sit in English. You sit, sat. It's linguistically related. We have shat and shidati, sidati, to sit. So it comes from there. To sit down close to oneself or to a teacher.
And I think, especially when words are in English, they are even more open to interpretation. So one translation I was researching on Upanishad was along the lines of, come near and let me destroy your view. And I loosely see the link to the way you've described it there, as in sit down. It's almost like lower your, I don't know, ego, expectation, lower those, like and then when you learn your true self, the closer you get to your true self, the more those things are stripped away. So I guess in learning wisdom like this, there is that destruction of you that isn't really you, I think.
Exactly. In fact, this definition, this explanation of the word Upanishad originates from a text by Sureshwaracharya, 8th century AD. He explains Upanishad as that which, as you approach it, because the root shat can also mean to destroy, but then destroy what? So he explains it as destruction of ignorance.
Wow.
And destruction of the self which arises out of an improper understanding of one's true nature.
Wow.
So the kind of understanding that, for example, we have of ourselves in the dream world because we have forgotten what we truly are. And so we start identifying with one particular character in the dream world. And whatever then happens to that character, we superimpose it back on ourselves.
Yeah.
And then
We'll defend it as well.
We defend it as well.
We'll defend the character that we have assumed.
Exactly. And in a sense, we are defending that character against ourselves, because the lion or the creature that is haunting us or that is jumping on us, it's also part of our being in the same way as that character.
That inner conflict is ever present in the mind of man.
Yes. That lies at the origin of the Upanishads, because
Wow.
every Upanishadic teaching starts from that inner conflict between the good and the bad forces within the human psyche.
Very nice. And that this delusion almost that we're talking about, could that be referred to as tatya?
That delusion is referred to as avidya or ajnana.
Okay.
The word that you used, which word was that?
Tatya, so opposite of satya, almost like relative truth.
Tatya. Yeah. In fact, I think the word that Gaudapadacharya uses is Vaitatya. So Vaitatya is the opposite of Tatya. So he uses this word in his Karikas on the Mandukya Upanishad. One of the sections is known as the section on Vaitatya, the section on false understanding. Because Tatya would be, Tatha means something which is the way it is supposed to be, and Vaitatya would be the opposite of that.
Okay.
So if you see a rope and you think it to be a snake, then that misconception of it as snake, that is Vaitatya, and the rope is Tatya.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Quite deep. Let's understand. So here's something else I noted from our early conversation. You were talking about hymns and what they're dedicated to. And my understanding of some of these hymns are almost a dedication to nature. You know, whenever we sit down to do a part or a puja or something like a vivaha sanskar, something a bit larger, Panditji will recite hymns, and these hymns are often dedicated to nature. And what I think I understand about that is when man was first understanding the world around him, he personified the forces of nature. Yeah, like we have Surya Devta, sun god, we have rain and wind and all the forces really. So is that right? That understanding of what those hymns are?
Yes, there is a lot more to that. So usually all the devas found in the, so these are the divinities found in the Vedas, they are categorized under 33 divinities. 8 of them are natural forces. 12 of them are temporal forces, forces within time. And so the first 8, they are macrocosmic forces, and the second group of 12 is temporal forces. The third group are microcosmic forces active within the human body. And then the last 2, they are the seer and the principle of sacrifice. So it's a lot more than that. The natural forces are just 8. And ultimately, again, what we have to keep in mind in the context of the Vedic teachings is that when they speak, for example, of the sun, then it's not only the external physical sun, but the sun that the yogis speak of within themselves. Or when they speak of the mind, of the moon, then it's not only the moon out there, but it refers to the mind, which, very much like the moon, does not have its own light, but gets illuminated by the light of consciousness in the understanding of the Upanishadic masters. So it works very much like the moon, and that's why the internal mind, the moon, becomes a symbol to the mind. So that is how these external forces then are, on a deeper level, also interpreted as forces active within the body, which then become objects of meditation and contemplation, and to explore the depths within oneself.
Deeply layered is
It's deeply layered, yes.
deeply layered is the philosophy of some of these texts.
Yes.
And I think we owe it to those that have dedicated their life to understanding such literature and passing that knowledge on.
Yes.
And much of the world is built like that, but you won't often find a rishi or someone so knowledgeable around. Like, you know, they're not on social media. It's not so easy to follow them. So I guess
There is,
maybe
there is a very interesting story in this context towards the end of a 6th century BC work, that when all the rishis left, there were no rishis anymore on the face of the earth. Humanity went to the divinities and said that you have, please send us some more rishis. We need someone to guide us. Then the divine is supposed to have said, according to the story present there, that I have left one rishi amongst you, which is tarka, the capacity to infer, the capacity to draw conclusions, rational thinking. That is the last rishi that I have left with you. Follow that and follow the teachings that are there. You will never go astray.
so. Even if we read all the books, we're still left our own devices to interpret and think and infer.
In fact, one of the first teachings that I was given as a child is that, in the same way as a mirror is totally useless for someone who has no eyes, these texts, they are useless for someone who has no internal, does not make an internal effort
Sure.
to understand them. So they have to talk to the internal aspect.
These are texts that you won't get benefit from by just reading. There's got to be a degree of contemplation and sitting down and analysis. Some effort is required on your part to.
Yes, in fact, the word brahmacharya just precisely means this. Today, the word brahmacharya is being given a very limited meaning, but
Sure.
in fact, it simply means lifestyle to explore Brahman, and Brahman in this case precisely refers to the Vedic knowledge. So the kind of lifestyle that a person needs to live to explore these Vedic teachings, that is what the word brahmacharya stands for.
Thank you very much, Siddharth Ji. We have been talking about the Vedas, the Upanishads, some of the detail around some of those, but why is something like scripture so important? Why does, say, the Hindu religion need its books? What has that done for mankind, for history?
First of all, the Vedas were written down as books only around the 9th century AD. Before that, it was more teacher student. So the teachers gave these teachings to their students. The student, they memorized it, kept it in memory. Even today, there are people who have kept alive the tradition in that way. And in fact, you can have mistakes in the books, but if you're not sure about those mistakes, you can actually check with them. And that's how precisely they have, and there are elaborate methods to keep this precision intact.
What a unique science. That's very strange to hear. If
Yeah.
the books have got it wrong, we can go back and check with humans, because the way in which they've learnt it, there can't be mistakes.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Is there anything else in the world that's like that?
Not known to me, except most likely some of the Buddhist Theravada Pali texts. I think some of the monks, inspired by this same dedication to the Vedas that they saw, they have this dedication also for the Buddha's
Wow.
teachings.
And so my understanding about why texts are important to mankind is because knowledge was passed through scripture.
Yes, it was passed through scriptures. It is like the way Patanjali puts it, that they are one of the three methods of acquiring infallible or correct understanding. So you have your senses, you have inference, and you have the experience of the ancient masters. So our senses help us to gather information about the world out there. Inference helps on both ends, external as well as internal, and the Vedas help us explore the internal world. So simply if you just close your eyes, all you see is darkness, but then the Vedas, they give us the light and the tools, the practices. Yoga has its origins in the Vedas. So the whole system of yoga as a tool to explore the inner layers of a human being. That for that, I think we are immensely dependent on these teachings, and that is why even before asana, Patanjali, the great master of yoga, before yogic postures, asks his students to study the teachings. And the whole idea in yoga, in fact, is that practice and study, they both go hand in hand, because the more you practice, the deeper you understand the teaching, and the better you understand the teaching, the deeper you can go into your practice.
Perfectly put. Theory and practice go well
Yeah,
together.
theory and practice go well together. Yes.
I'm finding it very difficult to sum up anything you say, because you're so eloquent in your the way you're describing things, and it's great. It's fascinating to be on this side. So Siddhartha Ji, we've spoken a little bit about, and I keep a little bit. I think we'll ever get to the end of the Hindu library, but we will push on. But before we go there, and it's my great privilege to do this, because we'll get to learn a little bit more about you. But now we're going to enter the rapid fire round. Siddhartha, what goes into your perfect breakfast smoothie?
Oh, smoothie.
Or just your perfect breakfast?
Yeah, perfect breakfast. Okay, paranthas we have here in India. That's quite common. And then one vegetable, that's usually what I have, any vegetable really. And yeah, that's it. When I have it, but I don't have it every day because usually we have an early lunch. So I don't have breakfast regularly, but when I have, this is what's it. Yeah.
I love parathas for breakfast too. So next time you're in the UK, please come over. We'll have to have parathas together. This I really thought about asking you this one, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you were stranded on a desert island and you could only take 3 items with you, what would they be and why?
The Bhagavad Gita.
Okay, we'll talk more about that later. Sure.
Yeah. And my laptop.
Okay.
And my mobile.
Brilliant. Awesome. Okay.
My laptop because I have my entire library on it.
Sure.
And my laptop my mobile allows me to be in touch with all my friends.
Perfect. We don't ask for much, hey. Mobile, laptop, and of course the Bhagavad Gita, which we will cover in more detail later on in this podcast.
Yes.
What is the best piece of advice anyone has ever given to you?
The best piece of advice that I go back again and again is to keep on looking for unity in diversity, but at the same time respecting and appreciating the diversity as well. So unity in diversity with total respect for diversity.
Wow.
That has sort of been my guiding principle in everything that I do.
That's great. And I think a lot more people need to hear that and then understand that. That was quite deep. Thank you for sharing. Do you have a favorite book?
Other than the Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah, I think so.
Other than the Bhagavad Gita, my favorite book is the Upanishads. That's what I like tremendously.
But that's not one book, is it? That's 108
at least,
books?
Yeah, 108, but 10 classical ones, most ancient ones, the most respected ones. These are basically the Yoga Sutras would be the third one.
Sure.
And
I guess on an episode called The Hindu Library, that this wasn't a very great question because we're going to be going through most of them anyway. Siddhartha-ji, what does sustainability mean to you?
Yeah, I've been exploring this idea lately quite a lot. And I think to lead one's life as simply as possible with as few possessions as possible. And that's part of my upbringing, the way my father, particularly, he made me travel on foot without money through different parts of India with him already quite young as a child. Though, to be honest, my mother always used to give me some money, which I used to hide for just in case there is an emergency. But for him, he didn't know it. He just wanted us to be really traveling, so that we learn how to live with as little things and as few possessions as possible. And it's a wonderful revelation because ultimately you realize how few things you really need in your life, and the rest just takes up a lot of space. So decluttering, I think, is what I try to practice quite a lot in my life.
Physically and mentally, right? And all levels, really.
Yes, on all levels. It starts from the physical level, but then you realize that in fact you are cluttering thoughts in your own mind. So then it also goes onto those levels. Yes.
Brilliant. And that's why I think we should all maintain a clean space in which we occupy. And for most people, if you can start with your bedroom, if you can keep your bedroom tidy, make your bed every morning, that's the beginning of some sense of discipline, the beginning of decluttering, and then you can extend that decluttering process to the rest of your life. Siddhartha, I'm not going to ask you to make a commitment today, but if you could share with our audience a commitment that maybe they could take up to be more sustainable, what would that be? Every podcast I have, I ask my speakers to make
Yes.
a commitment to how they can be more sustainable. And we've had all things like I'll do more yoga, or I'm going to reflect on my own finances, etc. So we've had a few. Is there something that you could share with our audience that's something that they could take up if they wanted to?
Reduce at least one possession. Try to see what can be externally as well as internally, because I think one of the core messages, the first message that the Upanishads bring across, is that nourishment, deeper nourishment, does not happen by accumulating, but by letting go, which is a very counterintuitive statement, because usually we think that we nourish ourselves by accumulating a lot. But on this path, nourishment happens by reducing our possessions.
That's
So
great.
that would be a wonderful. That's a commitment that I myself try to practice as well.
Very nice.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll end the rapid fire round there. Let's get back into exploring the Hindu library. Here today on the Vichar Manthan podcast with Siddhartha G. Krishna, live from Rishikesh. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you once again, Smriti.
So we've talked about Vedas, we've talked about Upanishads. I want to know, only because I've watched them both and I know a little bit about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Like, how important are they? Where do they fall in the pecking order of the Hindu library? And can we talk a little bit about them in more detail?
Yes. The Vedic Hindu library is divided into Shruti and Smriti. So you have what we just discussed now, which means earlier, the Vedas and the Upanishads. They are known as the Shruti literature. And Shruti means heard, that which is heard. So you just hear it from the teacher and then imbibe it. Smriti is what comes out after you hear those teachings. You imbibe them, you digest them, and you some of the munis, the great contemplatives, they came up with their own ideas based on those teachings. They are known as smriti. Smriti, in fact, as I said, it means mindfulness, it means memory, it means remembrance. So when you remember those teachings and you live a life in accordance to them, then, so the very purpose of these two, Ramayana, Mahabharata, as well as the Puranas, is to present an easily accessible version of those ancient Vedic teachings through stories, through historical stories, as well as imagined stories. So you have both types. You have actual history and you have also many imagined stories. The whole idea of itihasa, as it is known in Sanskrit, which is today translated as history, but originally in the Vedic context, in fact, simply meant to present the deeper essence of the Vedic teachings, which are not easily graspable unless a person really leads such a life and has dedicated years and years to study them, so that it becomes easily graspable to anyone and everyone. So that's the purpose of the Mahabharata, that's the purpose of the Puranas and of Ramayana.
That's a nice way of putting it, because often people will say things like, "Oh, it didn't really happen; it's just a story." But that's a very elementary way of looking at what could be argued as some of the most powerful moral books of our history.
Yes.
Right? We uncover a wealth of knowledge from these things. So whether they happened or not,
yes,
it doesn't even enter the room, I believe. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. I would really agree. And the message is what? And the slight difference between Mahabharata and Ramayana is that in Ramayana, everything is very clear, black and white. You have the evil side, Ravana, you have the good side, Rama. So it's very, very clear. Mahabharata explores more the gray zones.
Sure.
So Mahabharata is far more complex.
There's a lot more
Than
characters, a lot more
a lot more
personalities.
characters, a lot more personalities. You don't, even the best characters are not all good, and even the worst characters are not all bad. So you have the plot is far more, and in fact, the Mahabharata professes that to bring across dharma, sometimes which is garbed in the garb or in the dress of adharma, or sometimes adharma which is dressed as dharma, and sometimes dharma which is dressed as itself. So these are the three possibilities. And how can a person with a sharp intellect recognize each one of these as they are? The Mahabharata, through its stories, through its plots, and then because the plots are in fact just 1/5 of the Mahabharata.
Wow.
In fact, the Mahabharata is like it's an encyclopedia
Yes,
of ancient India, and it's vast. It has there is a saying of the Mahabharata itself: "Yadi hasti tadanyatra yanne hasti na tatvachit." Whatever is in here will be found somewhere else, and whatever is not in here will not be found anywhere else. So it's really a collection of. That's why it is very, very big.
It's known as the epic. It's
known as the epic. Yes, the big epic.
My knowledge of Mahabharata is
it's huge.
That which came on TV, I think it was 1988 or something like that. BBC Two, it was.
That was just, as I said, the plot is just 1/5.
Wow, that's amazing to think. Because as a child, I remember watching it, and actually more recently during lockdown, as a family, we started watching it again.
My teacher used to say that this Mahabharata serial is the sugar coating of your pill without the pill.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot more to uncover, but I feel even as a child watching that, maybe subconsciously whatever principles and values were embedded in me are great, but even now later on in life where I'm beginning to intellectualize a bit further, standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to academia and being privileged to even host a podcast to speak to great minds like yourselves, I am only now beginning to uncover some of the values and truths at a deeper level that would have come out of some of the stories. Like I remember crying when Bhisham Pitama was struck down by Arjun.
Yes.
And my mum remembers that day because as a child, I was only maybe 4 or 5 years old. It was maybe that uncovered something deep within me. But there were many stories along the way which I'll go back to and revisit and realize I knew from a child. So I feel very blessed to have. And the same goes for the Ramayana, although I was a little younger.
I do have exactly similar memories. I was maybe 8 or 9, and we used to come in the evening back from the monastery where I studied, and then I and my father, we used to watch it on television, and I remember sometimes really crying quite a lot. Yes.
The stories I hear of the time in India when it used to come on, obviously televisions are scarce, so the whole country would halt. And would tune in to the latest episode. And
if you were traveling on a bus, everybody agreed to stop at 9:30 in the morning and just watch the episode and then move ahead.
Wow,
nobody wanted to miss it.
What a way to unite a nation, and through the exploration of some of our ancient texts, and in this case particular, the epic.
And that's what the Mahabharata has done. Mahabharata really has united not only India, but I would say all of Southeast Asia. Mahabharata and Ramayana. It's extremely influential in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Cambodia, in all these countries, up to Philippines. These stories, they resonated so deeply in ancient times that even today, particularly the Indonesians, they relate immensely with Ramayana and Mahabharata, even today, apart from the Indians and the Nepalese.
I didn't know that. And I mean, I've heard of the great temples of Southeast, but what you've just said there, makes me want to go and explore it even further. And so within the Mahabharata, we have the shining star, I'm going to call it, which is the Srimad Bhagavad Gita.
Yes.
Help me understand why that is seen to be so important, because I don't understand.
Uh, there are 5 Gitas in the Mahabharata. This is the most well known one. And the reason I think it rose to such tremendous prominence is that there is no better summary of the Upanishads. And remember, the Upanishads are a summary of the deeper teachings of the Vedas. So Gita becomes really the best summary of the Upanishads and the Vedas presented in a simple, easily accessible method. Simpler than the Upanishads, far simpler than the Vedas. And yet it really contains the very. Usually, what happens is that when you start simplifying things, you lose the depth. But I think, and there were many attempts of simplification before the Bhagavad Gita, after the Bhagavad Gita, by Krishna himself. Krishna has spoken 3 Gitas. Uddhava Gita is well known. Anugita to Arjuna at a later time is also well known. And then this Srimad Bhagavad Gita. And yet, Srimad Bhagavad Gita stands out uniquely because it somehow does not lose that depth, and also then the whole the circumstances in which it was spoken, where Arjuna is struck by grief and is suffering immensely, and Krishna instead of really teaching him anything, just is trying to help him gain clarity by presenting the very summum bonum of the Vedic teachings. I think no other text in so short, just 700 verses. You have the Rig Veda, just the Rig Veda has more than 10,000 mantras.
Wow.
Historically, we believe that the whole of the Vedas have 100,000 mantras. So to summarize these 100,000 mantras in just 700 verses, which can be recited in 1 hour or 1.5 hours, this was like in Hindi, we say to fill the ocean into the pot. Gagar mein sagar bhar dena. This is, I think, what the Bhagavad Gita does to the utmost degree of perfection, more than any other text known to me. And that's why it has this great aura, this great name and respect in the Indian traditions. And yes, another thing that is very unique about the Bhagavad Gita, that within Hinduism, because there are so many different traditions, but this is so universal. It does not go into sectarian differences. And so every different sampradaya, as we call it in Sanskrit, sect might not be the correct word, but teacher-student tradition of wisdom, each one of them, without any discrimination, can relate to the Bhagavad Gita, because Bhagavad Gita is very universal, all-embracing. So that's also something very unique about the Bhagavad Gita, which is not the case with many other modern, by modern I mean texts which were composed in the last 2,000 or 2,500 years.
Very rarely am I lost for words, and you paint the picture so vividly about how unique and amazing the Bhagavad Gita is. But to someone who's never heard of it, I mean, the way you described it, it's almost like the guide to life. Like,
yes.
And I was once told, if ever you're facing a problem in life, or some hurdles, and you've exhausted all your possibilities, you can turn to the Gita and you open it at any page, and whatever you find on that page will be sure to help you out.
That's my experience. That was Mahatma Gandhi's experience. Whenever he was faced with the greatest of problems during his freedom fight, he turned to the Bhagavad Gita. From the first person who, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, up to Mahatma Gandhi, I think every freedom fighter was deeply inspired by the Bhagavad Gita. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that India received its freedom by following the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita.
Wow. And that's a guide to life and a guide to freedom for a nation.
Yes. ultimately freedom from one's own ignorance. So yes,
Very, very
freedom is
powerful.
the core message. Freedom from ignorance is really the core message of the Bhagavad Gita.
And also, it's, and we talk about all these scriptures, right? As if, earlier on we went into some detail about them being hymns or scripture or spoken, but at a scientific level, at a mathematical level, these texts are near perfect. I remember I've got a friend, Dr. Rishi Handa, who we'll have to bring onto the podcast at some stage, was telling me, I'm going to get this quote wrong, but something along the lines of, if you divide the number of verses to words on each page of the Gita, you will get pi every time. Something like that. Some type of mathematical perfectionism within the text that is the Gita. Is it?
Yes, of course. I don't know now specifically about that because I have not explored these mathematical aspects of the teachings. I've been more focused on really the philosophical and the yogic aspect. But yes, mathematics is part of astronomy, not astrology, but Vedic astronomy, Jyotish as it is called. It's as part of rituals, geometry, which is known as geometry. There is a lot to be explored, but unfortunately, I have not gone into that direction at all.
No worries. There's plenty of wisdom that we're unlocking here today. I don't even feel like we've scratched the surface when it comes to the Hindu library, but are there any other pieces of text or literature that you think we should definitely mention here today?
Okay, so we have already mentioned the Bhagavad Gita, we have mentioned the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, we have mentioned the Puranas, particularly Bhagavata Purana, which is very now well known in India. A lot of
And
Bhagavad
there's
Saptaha go on,
and there's
for
also
example.
the Garud Puran.
The Garuda Purana, they are part of the 18 Puranas, so there are 18 Puranas.
And there are
Garuda Purana
particular
is
times at which these Puranas are
Garuda
sort of.
Purana is usually read after somebody has passed away,
Yeah,
specifically, and Bhagavad Purana can be read at any time. It's the life stories of Krishna mainly, and they are very popular in India. And then from the 8th century onwards, you have this vast literature by the great acharyas. Shankaracharya, 8th century, then Ramanujacharya, 10th century. They have written many, many commentaries on these works. And so there is this entire Vedantic literature, as it is known, which starts with Shankaracharya primarily, but there are also some authors prior to him. This Vedantic literature, so we should not leave that out. I think, because that's the way to then explore the Bhagavad Gita, to explore the Upanishads, and then ultimately to explore the Vedas through the teachings, depending on which tradition you belong to. If you belong to the Ramanuja tradition, you will explore it through his
sure.
lens. If you belong to Shankaracharya's tradition, like I belong to Shankaracharya's tradition, so my lens will be Shankaracharya's lens.
Thank you very much for that, Siddhartha Ji. I think there are many more questions that one could have around the Hindu library. The Vicharamantan podcast has done its best today in the short amount of time that we have to just open the doors. I think there are many more texts that we should definitely consider and explore. I have many more questions around sort of shastras, shlokas, mantras, and maybe primers on each of those, but we will have to explore another time. So, Siddhartha Ji, thank you very much for coming on the Vicharamanthan podcast today. Is there one nugget of knowledge or wisdom that you would like to share with our listeners? What would that be?
My favorite passages, two of them. One is from the Rig Veda, Ekam Sat. The truth is one, but Vipraha Bahudha Vadanti. The wise express it in numerous ways. Let therefore beautiful thoughts come to me unhindered from everywhere. And then adding to this from the Bhagavad Gita, my favorite passage from the Bhagavad Gita, be passionately engaged in the well-being of all beings.
That's beautiful. That's very, very nice.
These are my favorite passages from the Veda as well as the Bhagavad Gita.
And these are words I think that we can all live by. Thank you very much, Siddhartha ji, for sharing them with us. To all the listeners out there, I hope you've understood just a little bit more about how deep and rich the Hindu civilization is and the amazing pieces of literature and scripture that have come out of that. Like I said, we've only just begun to scratch the surface with such deep and meaningful texts. This is the Vicharamantan podcast. My name is Sumit Sharma. Namaste.